Welcome back to Mr. Midnight. So, I need to tell you something about Alaska's abandoned towns. Last month, I came across 6 incident reports that honestly kept me up for days. We're talking pipeline workers, mail carriers, people just doing their normal jobs who walked into these dead mining towns and found, well, they weren't dead. Not really. Picture this: you're fixing an oil leak in the middle of nowhere, and you see lights in a town that's been empty since 1962. Or you're delivering mail, and everyone on your route gets murdered with railroad spikes from 1943. Yeah. These aren't ghost stories your uncle tells at camping. These are actual people, with names, jobs, psychiatric records, who ran into something out there that the government really doesn't want us talking about. I've got the testimonies. I've got the details that'll make your skin crawl. And honestly, after reading these, I'm never going near an abandoned town again. Ever. Hit subscribe if you want more stories that'll mess with your head. And let's get into it. Because what's waiting in these Alaskan ghost towns, it's still working. Still hunting. Still very much alive. My name is Marcus Chen, and I've been working oil pipeline maintenance in Alaska for 18 years. Started as a roughneck right out of trade school, worked my way up to senior field technician. I've spent winters in -40 weather, fixed pumps during blizzards that would kill most people, and crawled through pipeline sections that hadn't seen maintenance since the 1972. In Alaska, you learn to respect the cold, the isolation, and the fact that help is always too far away. But what I found in Copper Creek in February 2024 broke something in me that no amount of cold ever could. I've seen men lose fingers to frostbite, watched hypothermia take guys who thought they were tough enough for anything. I've pulled bodies out of machinery that froze solid overnight. But nothing in 18 years of Alaska pipeline work prepared me for what's still happening in that town. Most people don't know about Copper Creek. It's not on tourist maps, not mentioned in the ghost town books you can buy in Anchorage gift shops. The town died in 1962 when the copper mine played out, and the last official resident left in 1968. What makes it different from the dozens of other dead mining towns scattered across Alaska is simple. The people in Copper Creek never stopped working. The call came in on February 14th, Valentine's Day. Pipeline section 47C was showing pressure drops. Possible leak somewhere along the remote northern stretch that runs past the old mining towns. Standard job: take the snowcat, follow the pipeline, find the leak, patch it up. Should have been a 2-day assignment, maybe 3 if the weather turned bad. My supervisor, Bill Kowalski, pulled me aside before I left. Bill's been in Alaska since the original pipeline construction in the 72nds. Seen everything this state can throw at a man. But that morning, he looked worried. "Marcus, I need you to stay on the pipeline route," he said, checking my GPS tracker twice. "Don't go wandering around up there. Some of those old towns, they're not as empty as they should be." "What do you mean?" I asked, loading my repair kit into the snowcat. Bill was quiet for a long moment, staring at the map on his office wall. "Just stick to the pipeline, find the leak, fix it, come home. Don't spend the night up there if you can help it." I should have listened. The ride to section 47C took 6 hours through some of the most desolate country in Alaska. Snow stretching to the horizon, mountains that looked like broken teeth, and a wind that cut through every layer of clothing like it had a personal grudge. The pipeline ran like a steel snake across the landscape, raised on supports to keep it from freezing to the permafrost. I found the leak around 3 p.m., a small crack in a joint that had been weakened by thermal expansion. Easy fix, maybe 2 hours of work. But by the time I finished welding the patch, the sun was already setting, and the temperature was dropping fast. The snowcat's heater was acting up, and I knew trying to drive back in the dark with failing heat would be suicide. That's when I remembered Copper Creek. According to my map, it was only about 3 miles east of the pipeline. Most of these old mining towns still had a few buildings standing, maybe even some shelter for the night. Better than freezing in a broken snowcat. I followed what looked like an old road, though it was hard to tell under 3 feet of snow. The GPS showed the town right where it should be, but as I came over a small ridge, I saw something that made me stop the snowcat and check my equipment. Copper Creek had lights on. Not just 1 or 2 buildings, the whole town was lit up like Christmas. I could see smoke coming from chimneys, people moving around between the buildings, even what looked like vehicles parked along the main street. My radio started picking up chatter, voices talking about shift changes and ore quotas. I grabbed my radio and tried to reach Bill. Nothing but static. The GPS was working fine, showing me exactly where I should be, but according to every record I'd ever seen, Copper Creek had been dead for 60 years. I drove closer, and the details got stranger. The buildings looked new, freshly painted, with modern electric lights in the windows. But the vehicles I'd seen were all from the 1950s and early 60s. Old pickup trucks, a few cars with those big rounded fenders. Even what looked like mining equipment from that era. A man flagged me down as I reached the main street. He was wearing work clothes that looked period correct, but brand new, like costume pieces that had never been worn. Clean-shaven, maybe 40 years old, with the kind of pale skin you get from working underground. "You lost, friend?" he asked, walking up to my snowcat. "This weather's not fit for traveling." "I was looking for shelter for the night," I said. "My heater's acting up, and I didn't want to risk the drive back to Fairbanks." The man smiled, and I noticed his breath wasn't steaming in the cold. Mine was coming out in thick white clouds, but his words carried no visible vapor at all. "Well, you're in luck," he said. "We've got plenty of room at the boarding house. Company policy. We don't turn away travelers in weather like this. I'm Tom Hendricks, mine foreman." I climbed out of the snowcat, and immediately something felt wrong. The town was warm. Not just the buildings, the whole area seemed to exist in its own pocket of climate. The snow was lighter here, and I could smell things that had no business existing in February in Alaska. Fresh bread, coffee, even flowers. "What kind of mine are you running here?" I asked as Tom led me toward a large wooden building with Copper Creek Boarding House painted on the sign. "Same as always," Tom replied. "Copper extraction, some silver. Been working the same vein since 1924. Good ore, consistent quality. Mr. Morrison runs a tight operation." I stopped walking. Morrison. That was the name of the mining company that had owned Copper Creek, according to the historical records. Morrison Copper and Mining, Incorporated 1924. Dissolved 1963. "How long have you been working here?" I asked. Tom thought about it for a moment, like it was a hard question. "Started in '58, been here ever since. Good steady work, fair wages. Not many places left where a man can make an honest living underground." Inside the boarding house, everything was exactly what you'd expect from a 1950s mining town. Clean but simple furniture, a big wood stove throwing heat, oil lamps mixed with electric lights, but all of it looked too new, too perfect. Like a museum exhibit that someone had decided to live in. The woman who ran the boarding house introduced herself as Mrs. Fletcher. She was maybe 50, wearing a house dress and apron that belonged in a magazine from 1960. She served me dinner, pot roast, mashed potatoes, green beans, and it was the best meal I'd had in months. "We don't get many visitors in winter," she said, setting down a cup of coffee that somehow stayed perfectly hot despite the ceramic mug feeling cold in my hands. "Most folks know to avoid the mountain roads this time of year. I work on the oil pipeline," I explained. "Had to fix a leak, got stuck by the weather." Mrs. Fletcher's expression changed slightly, like I'd said something confusing. "Oil pipeline? I don't know anything about that. This is copper country. Always has been." After dinner, I walked around the town. Every building was occupied and active. The general store had shelves stocked with goods from the 1950s. Brands I recognized from old advertisements, products that had been discontinued decades ago. The barbershop had customers getting haircuts with pomade and straight razors. There was even a small movie theater showing a film I'd never heard of, something called Mountain Gold that the poster claimed was now playing 1961. But it was the mine itself that made my skin crawl. The entrance was a large tunnel cut into the mountainside, with rail tracks leading in and out. Modern electric lights illuminated the opening, and I could hear the sounds of active mining. Drills, machinery, men shouting instructions. A steady stream of ore cars came out of the tunnel, filled with copper ore that gleamed in the artificial light. I checked my watch. 11:30 p.m. Who runs a mine at midnight in February in Alaska? That's when I noticed the workers coming off the night shift. They walked out of the mine in a steady line, maybe 30 men, all carrying lunch pails and wearing hard hats. They looked tired but satisfied, like men finishing an honest day's work. But none of them were breathing visible vapor in the cold air. I followed a group of them toward the boarding house, staying in the shadows. Their conversation was normal work talk, complaining about a difficult vein, discussing plans for the weekend, arguing about baseball teams, but something was off about their voices. They sounded flat, like recordings played at slightly the wrong speed. One of them mentioned the date, February 14th, 1962. Good thing this cold snap is breaking. I ran back to my snowcat and grabbed my phone. No signal, which was normal for this area. But the GPS was still working, and it confirmed what I already knew. I was in Copper Creek, Alaska, a town that had been abandoned for over 60 years. I spent that night in the boarding house, in a clean room with sheets that smelled like they'd been line-dried in summer sunshine. But I didn't sleep. Every few hours, I heard the mine whistle blowing, calling the next shift to work. And each time, I heard footsteps in the hallway, men heading out to work, jobs that shouldn't exist. The next morning, Mrs. Fletcher served me breakfast like she'd been doing it every day for decades. Eggs, bacon, fresh biscuits, coffee that tasted better than anything I'd ever had. But when I tried to pay her, she looked confused. Pay? This is company housing, Mr. Chen. Meals are included. Mr. Morrison takes good care of his employees. I don't work for Morrison Mining, I said. Of course you do, she replied, smiling. You've been here since 1958, same as Tom. Good steady work, fair wages. I grabbed my gear and headed for the snowcat, but Tom Hendricks was waiting for me. Where are you going? He asked. Shift starts in 20 minutes. Mr. Morrison doesn't like tardiness. I need to get back to Fairbanks, I said. I've got a job to get back to. Tom looked genuinely confused. This is your job, has been for years. Come on, I'll show you to your section. He started walking toward the mine, and I felt a pull to follow him. Not physical, but something deeper, like muscle memory I didn't have. Part of me wanted to go into that tunnel, find my assigned section, start working the copper veins like I'd been doing for years. But I fought it. I climbed into the snowcat and started the engine. As I drove away from Copper Creek, I looked back and saw Tom standing in the road, watching me leave with the saddest expression I'd ever seen on a human face. You'll be back, he called after me. They always come back. The drive to the pipeline should have taken an hour. It took me 4. 3 times, I found myself taking wrong turns that led me back toward Copper Creek. The GPS kept trying to recalculate routes that would take me back to town. And every mile I drove, the pull got stronger. The feeling that I was making a terrible mistake, abandoning my real job, my real life. When I finally reached the pipeline, my phone immediately picked up signal. 17 missed calls from Bill Kowalski, all from the last hour. I called him back. Jesus Christ, Marcus, where have you been? He shouted. Your GPS tracker went dead yesterday afternoon. I've had search and rescue looking for you all night. My GPS was working fine, I said. I was in Copper Creek. Long silence on the other end. Marcus, Bill said finally, his voice very quiet. Copper Creek is gone, has been since the 60 seconds. I drove up there myself when you went missing. There's nothing there but foundation stones and collapsed buildings. I drove back to Fairbanks, filed my report, and took a week off. But I couldn't stop thinking about Copper Creek. The warm air, the fresh coffee, Mrs. Fletcher's pot roast. The feeling of belonging somewhere, of having work that mattered. I started researching the town's history. Morrison Copper and Mining had operated there from 1924 to 1962. The mine had been profitable until a cave-in killed 37 workers on February 14, 1962. After that, the company couldn't keep workers. People reported strange accidents, tools that moved by themselves, voices calling them into dangerous areas of the mine. The final closure came in 1963 when the remaining workers simply disappeared. All of them, 12 men who went into the mine for a regular shift and never came out. Search teams found no bodies, no signs of cave-ins or gas leaks. The men had just vanished. But what bothered me most was the personnel records. I found them in the Alaska State Archives, and there it was. Marcus Chen, hired February 1958 as an equipment maintenance specialist. 5 years before I was born. I went back 3 weeks later, told Bill I was checking pipeline section 48A, which was close enough to Copper Creek to make the story believable. But I had to see if it was real, if the town was still there. I found it easily this time. Like I'd been driving those roads all my life. The town was exactly as I remembered, warm, welcoming, alive with activity. Tom Hendricks greeted me at the town limits, like he'd been waiting. "Welcome back, Marcus," he said. "Your section's been waiting for you. We've got some equipment that needs your expertise." This time, I didn't resist. I followed him into the mine. The tunnels were vast, well-lit, and warm despite being carved into permafrost. Electric lights ran along the walls, and the air circulation was better than any modern mine I'd ever seen. My section was a machine shop, fully equipped with tools and equipment from the 1,950 seconds that worked perfectly. I spent 8 hours repairing mining equipment, adjusting pumps, maintaining the rail system that carried ore to the surface. It was the most satisfying work I'd ever done. No bureaucracy, no safety meetings, no environmental regulations, just good, honest work that mattered. When the shift whistle blew, I felt genuine regret that the day was over. Mrs. Fletcher had a hot meal waiting at the boarding house. Other workers talked to me like we'd been friends for years, sharing stories and jokes I somehow understood. I had a room that felt like home, a bed that was perfectly comfortable, and a place where everyone knew my name. I stayed for 3 days. Every morning, I woke up excited to go to work. Every evening, I sat with friends who understood me in ways my real friends never had. And every night, I forgot a little more about the outside world. On the 4th morning, I couldn't remember my real job at all. I knew I worked at the mine, had been there since 1958, was a valued member of the Morrison Copper team. The idea of leaving Copper Creek seemed not just impossible, but insane. That's when I found the newspaper in the boarding house lobby. The Copper Creek Gazette, February 14th, 1962. The headline read, "Mine explosion claims 37 lives." But underneath, in smaller text, "Survivors continue operations, despite tragedy." I was reading about my own death. The article listed the victims of the cave-in, and my name was there. Marcus Chen, 28, equipment specialist, survived by parents in California. But the article was dated 62 years ago, and I was very much alive, standing in the lobby of the boarding house, reading about my own funeral. That's when I understood what Copper Creek really was. It wasn't a ghost town, it was a town of ghosts. Everyone there had died in that cave-in, but we'd been so dedicated to our work, so connected to the mine, that we'd never stopped. We just kept working, kept living the same day over and over, convinced it was February 14th, 1962, and our jobs mattered. I ran to my room, grabbed my personal effects, my modern wallet, my cell phone, the GPS unit that had led me here. Proof that I didn't belong, that I had a life outside this endless workday. But when I looked at my reflection in the mirror, I was wearing 1,950 seconds work clothes. My face looked younger, somehow different. And when I opened my wallet, my driver's license showed an issue date of February 1958. I was becoming part of Copper Creek, just like everyone else. I had maybe hours before I forgot everything about the outside world, before I became another permanent employee of Morrison Copper and Mining. I did the only thing I could think of. I went to the mine office and demanded to see my personnel file. "Mr. Morrison himself was there, a thin man in his 60s wearing a suit that looked like it had been pressed that morning. He smiled when he saw me, like a father welcoming home a prodigal son. "Marcus, Tom tells me you've been asking questions about the company, having doubts about your position here? I want to see my employment contract," I said. Morrison pulled out a filing cabinet and handed me a folder with my name on it. Inside was everything: my application, my references, my employment agreement dated February 1958. But at the bottom was a clause I'd never seen in any real contract. Employee agrees to maintain employment with Morrison Copper and Mining in perpetuity, regardless of physical status or temporal circumstances. Termination of contract requires unanimous consent of all active employees. "What does this mean?" I asked. Morrison's smile never wavered. It means we take care of our own, Marcus. Forever. No layoffs, no terminations, no retirement. Just good steady work until the end of time. But I'm not dead, I said. I have a real job. A real life outside this place. Do you? Morrison asked. Can you remember what you were doing on February 13th, 1962? Can you remember anything from before you started working here? He was right. My memories of the outside world were already fading. I could barely remember Bill Kowalski's name, couldn't picture my apartment in Fairbanks, had no idea what my real job involved, but I still had my phone. I turned it on, and somehow, miraculously, it had signal. I called the only number I could remember, 911. 911, what's your emergency? I'm trapped in Copper Creek, I said. The old mining town. Everyone here is dead, but they're still working. They're trying to make me one of them. Sir, are you injured? Are you in immediate danger? Yes, but not the way you think. They're erasing my memories, making me forget my real life. I need someone to come get me before I forget who I really am. There was a pause. Sir, can you provide your location? I gave them the GPS coordinates. But even as I spoke, I could see Morrison shaking his head sadly. They won't find you, Marcus, he said. Copper Creek exists between moments, in the space where people who love their work so much they can't let go. Emergency services can't reach a place that officially doesn't exist. He was right. The 911 operator told me there was no record of any active mining operation at those coordinates. No buildings, no people. To the outside world, I was standing in an empty field talking to myself. But I had one advantage Morrison didn't know about. I'm an oil pipeline technician. I know how to sabotage equipment. That night, while everyone slept, I went into the mine and found the main electrical system that powered the entire operation. It was a beautiful piece of 1,950 seconds engineering, built to last forever. But I knew how to make it fail. I disconnected the main feed, cut the backup cables, and damaged the generator that provided emergency power. Without electricity, the mine couldn't operate. Without the mine, Copper Creek had no reason to exist. The lights went out at exactly midnight. In the darkness, I heard something I'll never forget. The sound of 37 people screaming as they remembered, all at once, that they were dead. The town began to collapse around me. Buildings aged 60 years and 60 seconds, windows shattered, foundations cracked. The warm air turned arctic, and snow began falling inside the boarding house. I ran for my snowcat in the dark, guided only by muscle memory and desperation. Behind me, I could hear Morrison calling my name, begging me to come back, promising me steady work and good wages forever. But I kept running. The snowcat started on the first try, and I drove through a town that was dying around me. Buildings collapsed into snow-filled ruins, roads turned back into wilderness, and the mine entrance sealed itself with falling rock. By the time I reached the pipeline, Copper Creek was gone. When I looked back, there was nothing but empty wilderness under the Aurora Borealis. I filed my report, took early retirement, and moved to Florida. I told Bill Kowalski that I'd had a breakdown, that the isolation had gotten to me. He was understanding. Alaska burns out a lot of good men, but every night I dream about the mine. I dream about work that mattered, about friends who understood me, about a place where I belonged. In my dreams, Tom Hendricks is waiting for me at the town limits, smiling and asking when I'm coming back to work. And the terrible truth is, part of me wants to go back. I've been researching other abandoned mining towns in Alaska. There are dozens of them scattered across the state, places where men loved their work so much they couldn't let go even after death. Places where you can still hear machinery running in the middle of the night, where lights appear in windows of buildings that collapsed decades ago. The worst part is, I'm not the only one who's found them. I've met other pipeline workers, surveyors, geologists who've stumbled across towns that shouldn't exist. Most of them went back. They'd show up for work one day talking about taking early retirement, about finding a better job somewhere remote. Then they'd disappear, and their personnel files would show termination dates from 60 or 70 years ago. If you work in remote Alaska, if your job takes you to places where the maps are wrong and the GPS can't be trusted, be careful what shelter you accept when the weather turns bad. Some doors, once opened, never really close again. And if you ever find yourself in a place that's too warm, too welcoming, too perfect for what it should be. If the locals know your name even though you've never been there before, remember that some jobs are forever, even after forever ends. I'm telling you this because I'm weakening. Every year, the dreams get stronger. Every winter, I feel the pull getting harder to resist. I've destroyed my GPS units, thrown away my maps of Alaska, deleted every file that might lead me back to those coordinates. But yesterday, I got a letter. No return address, postmarked from Alaska. Inside was a paycheck from Morrison Copper and Mining, made out to Marcus Chen, for services rendered in February 1962. The amount was exactly what a mining equipment specialist would have made in that era. At the bottom, in handwriting I somehow recognize, someone had written, "Your section misses you. When can we expect your return? I'm going to burn this letter, just like I've burned all the others." But I know the truth now. Some contracts never expire. Some jobs follow you forever. And somewhere in the Alaska wilderness, in a town that exists between heartbeats, Tom Hendricks is still waiting for me to come back to work. The mine whistle blows every day at exactly 6 a.m. I hear it sometimes, even here in Florida. Even when I'm nowhere near a mine, it's calling me home. I'm not some city girl who got scared by wilderness sounds. I grew up in Fairbanks, learned to drive on ice before I could legally drink. I've pulled tourists out of ditches, delivered emergency insulin during blizzards, and once helped birth a baby when a pregnant woman went into labor on a backcountry road. My supervisor always said I was unshakable. I was wrong about that. Dead wrong. What happened on October 15th wasn't just a bad day at work. It wasn't trauma I could process and move on from. What happened in Chitina broke something fundamental in my understanding of reality. Because some places hold on to their dead so tightly that the line between past and present doesn't just blur, it disappears completely. The thing about ghost towns is that the name isn't always metaphorical. Sometimes the ghosts are real, and sometimes they're still working. I should start by explaining what Chitina was before it became what it is now. Most people driving through Alaska don't even know it exists. It's just a cluster of rotting buildings along an old railroad grade, easy to miss if you're not looking for it. But in the 1,940 seconds, Chitina was alive. Hundreds of railroad workers lived there, hauling copper ore from the Kennecott mines. The railroad company promised good wages and steady work to men desperate for jobs during the war. But the company lied. Working conditions were deadly: cave-ins, equipment failures, no safety gear. Workers were dying at twice the national average. In 1943, the men organized. They voted to strike, demanding basic safety measures and fair wages. The company's response was to hire strikebreakers, scabs, and keep the railroad running with replacement workers. That's when things got bloody. The striking workers blockaded the rail yard, trying to prevent the scabs from working. Company security opened fire on the picket line. In the chaos that followed, dozens died. The official records are sealed, but local accounts speak of workers beaten to death with railroad equipment, bodies thrown into mine shafts, families threatened into silence. The strike lasted 6 months. By the time it ended, most of the original workers were dead or driven away. The company won, but it was a Pyrrhic victory. Bad publicity and federal investigations forced them to shut down operations entirely by 1950. Chitina became a ghost town almost overnight. I learned this history from Martha Hendricks, one of my regular customers. Martha had been researching the strike for years, trying to document what really happened. She'd interviewed survivors' children, searched through old newspaper archives, even tracked down company records. She said the dead workers deserved to have their story told properly. I wish I'd listened more carefully to what she was trying to tell me. The morning of October 15th started normal. I loaded my truck at 6 a.m. with mail for 12 addresses scattered across the Chitina route. Light snow was falling, but nothing serious. My supervisor, Jim Rodriguez, reminded me to radio in at 2 p.m., like always. The drive out was peaceful, just me, the radio, an empty highway stretching through spruce forest and tundra. My first stop was always Martha's place, a converted railroad car about 5 miles off the main road. She'd lived there for 15 years, surviving on Social Security and a vegetable garden. Martha always had fresh coffee and stories about her research. She was excited about something she'd found in the archives, some kind of document that proved the company had covered up the real death toll. But when I knocked that morning, nobody answered. Martha's door was unlocked, which wasn't unusual. People don't lock doors much out here. I called her name and stepped inside. The coffee was still warm on the stove. Her research papers were spread across the kitchen table, photocopies of old documents, newspaper clippings, handwritten notes. I found Martha in the back room, slumped in her reading chair. At first I thought she'd had a heart attack or stroke. Then I saw the railroad spike driven through her forehead, and my training kicked in. Secure the scene, check for signs of life, radio for help, but my radio was dead, complete static. That was impossible. USPS radios are designed to work in remote areas, and I'd checked it that morning. I tried my cell phone, no service, which was normal out here, but the radio should have worked. I needed to check my other customers. If there was a killer loose, other people might be in danger. That's what I told myself as I drove to the next address, hands shaking so badly I could barely steer. The truth was, I couldn't process what I'd seen. My brain was protecting itself by treating it like a work problem I needed to solve. Bob Yamamoto lived 2 miles down a winding dirt track. Retired fisherman, lived alone, got mostly medical bills and pension checks. I'd been delivering to Bob for 3 years. He always came out to meet me at his truck, usually wanted to chat about weather or fishing. Bob was in his workshop, face down in a pool of blood. Railroad spiked through the back of his skull. His tools were scattered around like there'd been a struggle, but nothing was stolen. His wallet was still in his pocket, $53 untouched. I started hyperventilating. 2 people dead, both killed with antique railroad equipment. This wasn't random. Someone was hunting my customers systematically. The Miller family lived at the 3rd address. Tom, his wife Janet, and their teenage son Marcus. They'd moved to Chitina 5 years ago, looking for a simpler life away from Anchorage. Tom worked as a hunting guide. Janet homeschooled Marcus. Good people, quiet people. They didn't deserve what I found. All 3 dead in their living room. Railroad spikes. Tom had defensive wounds on his hands, like he'd tried to fight back. Janet was clutching Marcus's hand. The killer had made them watch each other die. That's when I broke down completely. I sat on their front porch and sobbed until I couldn't breathe. 3 families dead. People I'd known for years, reduced to crime scene statistics, and whoever had done this was still out there. I tried starting my truck to get out of there, but the engine wouldn't turn over. When I popped the hood, I saw that someone had cut my battery cables. Recently, the copper was still bright where the wire strippers had bit. Someone had planned this. Someone knew my route, knew my schedule. They'd sabotaged my truck to trap me here with the bodies. I grabbed my mailbag and started walking toward the old railroad yard. Maybe I could find a working phone, or at least a place to hide until help arrived. The radio check-in wasn't until 2 p.m., but Jim would send someone when I didn't return by evening. The railroad yard was a maze of rusted equipment and collapsed buildings. Most of the structures dated back to the 1942. The depot, the roundhouse, worker barracks, machine shops, everything was slowly being reclaimed by forest, but the bones of the old town were still visible. As I picked my way through the debris, I heard footsteps behind me. Slow, deliberate, like someone tracking an animal. I ducked behind a rusted locomotive and tried to control my breathing. Sarah Martinez. The voice came from my radio, crystal clear, despite the static that had been blocking everything else. Sarah Martinez. You're crossing the line. I clicked the transmit button with shaking fingers. Hello? This is Sarah Martinez, postal carrier badge 1847. I need emergency assistance. Multiple homicides at Chitina route addresses. You scabs are all the same, the voice continued, ignoring my plea. Crossing our lines, taking our jobs, breaking our strike. We voted fair and square. Nobody works until the company meets our demands. The voice was male, older, with an accent I couldn't place. But the content made no sense. What strike? What line was I crossing? That's when I saw him. Edgar Kowalski, shambling through the rail yard with a cloth bag in one hand and a railroad hammer in the other. I'd been delivering Edgar's mail for 3 years, though he rarely came to the door. He lived in a shack near the old depot, surviving on disability checks and whatever he could scavenge. People said he'd worked railroad somewhere before coming to Chitina, but he kept to himself. Edgar looked different now. His usual confusion was replaced by focused purpose, and his eyes had a flat, empty quality I'd never seen before. "Edgar," I called out, stepping into view. "Thank God someone's alive. We need to call for help. Someone's killing people." He turned toward me slowly, and when he smiled, ice formed in my stomach. "Found another one," he said to someone I couldn't see. "Young woman, probably new. They're getting bolder about crossing the line." "Edgar, I think you're confused. I'm Sarah, your postal carrier. I've been delivering your mail for years." "My mail?" He laughed, a sound like rusted machinery. "I don't get mail, Scab. None of us do. Company stopped paying us 6 months ago. But we're still here. Still working, still fighting." In Edgar's mind, it wasn't 2023. It was 1943, and he was a striking railroad worker defending his picket line. Somehow, his delusion had turned me into the enemy, a strikebreaker threatening his livelihood. But Edgar wasn't alone. As I watched in growing horror, translucent figures began materializing around him. Men in 1942 work clothes, carrying railroad tools, pointing at me and whispering in Edgar's ear. Their faces were twisted with anger that had been festering for 80 years. The ghosts of Chitina's striking workers, still fighting a battle they'd lost decades ago. I backed away slowly, but Edgar was already moving to cut off my escape. The ghost workers spread out in formation, herding me like a pack animal. They couldn't touch me directly, but they could direct Edgar with tactical precision. "Edgar, listen to me. The strike ended in 1943. Those men died 80 years ago. You're sick. You need help." "Help?" Edgar's voice cracked. "We don't need help. We need justice. We need the company to pay for what they did to our families." One of the ghost workers leaned close to Edgar's ear, and Edgar nodded grimly. "Billy says, you've been talking to that old woman. The one with all the papers. Says she's been spreading lies about us, trying to make people forget what really happened here." My blood turned to ice. They meant Martha. Her research into the strike had somehow attracted their attention. "She's been documenting the truth," I said, "trying to make sure people remember your sacrifice." "Truth?" Edgar spat. "Her truth says we lost. Says the company won, and we all just gave up. But we're still here, aren't we? Still fighting." I realized the horrible logic of the situation. The ghost workers were trapped in the moment of their defeat, convinced the strike was still ongoing. Anyone who entered their territory became a potential scab, and Edgar, in his deteriorating mental state, had become their instrument of vengeance. But they weren't just killing randomly. They were targeting people who represented modern life moving forward without acknowledging their sacrifice. Martha with her historical research, Bob with his retirement pension, the Miller family with their comfortable retreat from city life, all of them living normal lives while the ghost workers remained trapped in eternal protest. Edgar started walking toward me, raising the hammer. The ghost workers moved with him, translucent but somehow solid in the cold air. I turned and ran deeper into the railroad yard, Edgar's footsteps pounding behind me. The old buildings were like a maze, and I quickly got turned around. Every shadow looked like Edgar, every sound like footsteps. The ghost workers seemed to know the layout perfectly, appearing ahead of me to block escape routes, driving me toward the rail tunnel. I ducked into the old depot building and tried to catch my breath. Through broken windows, I watched Edgar searching methodically, the ghosts directing his movements with pointing gestures and whispered instructions. They'd been practicing this hunt for 80 years. My watch read 1:30 p.m., half an hour until my scheduled radio check-in. If I could survive until then, Jim might send help when I didn't respond. But as I watched Edgar's systematic search, I realized something that made my stomach drop. This wasn't random violence. It wasn't even just about the strike. Edgar and the ghosts were recreating something specific, the massacre that had ended the labor dispute in 1943. According to Martha's research, the final confrontation had taken place in the rail tunnel. Company security had trapped striking workers inside and collapsed both ends, claiming it was an accident. The workers had been buried alive, their bodies never recovered. Edgar was leading me toward that same tunnel. He was going to finish what started 80 years ago. I snuck out the back of the depot and made my way toward the tunnel entrance. If I could get through it before Edgar caught up, I'd come out near the main road. But the tunnel was dark, narrow, and I could hear Edgar getting closer. As I reached the entrance, the temperature dropped 30 degrees in seconds. My breath came out in white clouds, and frost began forming on the steel rails. The ghost workers were manifesting more strongly, drawing energy from my fear. I pulled out my flashlight and started into the tunnel. The beam revealed old rails disappearing into darkness, rotting railroad ties, and something else, scattered bones along the tunnel walls. The remains of the workers who died here in 1943. Still wearing the fragments of work clothes, still clutching railroad tools. Their skulls showed signs of blunt force trauma. They hadn't died in a collapse. They'd been murdered. And they were still angry. Behind me, Edgar entered the tunnel. His voice echoed off the walls. "End of the line, scab. Time to pay for what you did to us." The ghost workers materialized fully now, their rage giving them substance in this place where they died. But they didn't attack me directly. Instead, they formed a circle, trapping me in the center of the tunnel while Edgar approached with the hammer. "We voted," Edgar said, his voice mixing with a dozen ghostly whispers. "Fair and square. Nobody crosses the line. Nobody breaks our strike." I realized I was going to die here, in this tunnel, just like the workers in 1943. Beaten to death with railroad tools and left to rot in the darkness. Another casualty of a war that should have ended decades ago. But then I remembered something Martha had told me. Something about documents she'd found, proof the company had covered up the truth. What if the ghost workers were trapped not just by anger, but by incomplete information? "Edgar, wait!" I shouted as he raised the hammer. "The strike didn't fail. You won." He paused, confusion flickering across his face. "Martha found the real records," I continued, backing against the tunnel wall. "The company gave in to all your demands. Safety regulations, wage increases, union recognition. But they covered it up, made it look like you'd lost." The ghost workers were listening now, their circle of rage wavering. The families sued after the massacre. The company paid millions in settlements. Your deaths exposed their corruption, forced federal investigations. Workers' safety laws were changed because of what happened here. "You're lying," Edgar whispered, but his voice lacked conviction. "Check Martha's research. She documented everything. The memorial they built in 1950, listing all your names. The safety regulations passed in your honor. You didn't die for nothing. You changed everything." The cold air began to warm. Some of the ghost workers were fading, their anger finally beginning to dissolve. But others remained, and Edgar was still trapped in his delusion. "Even if that's true," he said, raising the hammer again, "what about them? What about the people The people who?" For the first time, sanity flickered in Edgar's eyes. He saw me clearly, not a 1,943 strikebreaker, but Sarah Martinez, the postal worker who'd been bringing him mail for 3 years. And he remembered what he'd done to Martha, to Bob, to the Miller family. "Oh God," he whispered, the hammer slipping from his fingers. "What did I do? What did they make me do?" The ghost workers began screaming, not in rage now, but in anguish. They'd been using Edgar to settle their unfinished business, but in doing so, they'd corrupted their own cause. They'd turned their fight for justice into a cycle of murder. Edgar staggered backward, horror replacing madness. "I thought, they told me you were." Oh God, those people had families. That's when I heard it. Helicopter rotors. Jim had sent search and rescue when I missed my check-in, but Edgar heard it too, and panicked. The approaching help meant he'd have to face what he'd done. He turned and ran deeper into the tunnel, toward a section I could see was structurally unsound. Decades of water damage and frost heave had weakened the overhead supports. "Edgar, don't go that way," I shouted. "The tunnel's not safe," but he was already gone, disappeared into the darkness. A few seconds later, I heard the grinding rumble of collapsing rock. The tunnel shook, dust and debris raining down. When it settled, that section was completely blocked. The ghost workers were fading now, their connection to the physical world severed by Edgar's death. But as they disappeared, I heard their whispers one last time. Tell them we were here. Tell them we fought." The rescue team found me 20 minutes later, sitting outside the tunnel entrance in catatonic shock. I told them about the murders, about Edgar, about the tunnel collapse. I didn't mention the ghosts. Who would believe that? The official investigation concluded that Edgar Kowalski, suffering from untreated schizophrenia and PTSD from his railroad work, had killed 4 people before dying in an accidental tunnel collapse. Case closed. But it wasn't closed. Not really. I took 3 months of medical leave, spent time with therapists who prescribed pills for PTSD and depression. When I returned to work, I requested a transfer to Anchorage city routes, suburban neighborhoods, office buildings, places where the only danger was aggressive dogs. I thought I was getting better. I thought I could put Chitina behind me. Then the letters started arriving. Not at work, at my home address, which isn't public record. Handwritten letters in spidery script, postmarked from Chitina, even though the post office there had been closed since 1987. The return address was always the same. E. Kowalski, Chitina, Rail Yard. The first letter was just 3 words. Still fighting, Sarah. The second was longer. They made me forget who I was, made me hurt innocent people. But death doesn't end the fight. It just changes the battlefield. By the 5th letter, Edgar was explaining the rules of his new existence, how the ghost workers had claimed him after death, made him part of their eternal strike, how they were recruiting others, workers who died in industrial accidents, people who'd been exploited by corporations, anyone who died fighting for justice. We're organizing, Sarah, his latest letter read, building our numbers. The 1,943 strike was just the beginning. We're going to settle accounts with everyone who profited from our suffering. The letters come every few weeks now, updating me on their activities. A mining executive who died in his sleep after laying off 100 workers. A factory owner who had a heart attack during a labor dispute. A corporate lawyer who drove off a bridge while defending a company accused of safety violations. Edgar writes about them like union victories, strikes that ended favorably. He's still trapped in that 1943 mindset, still fighting a war that should have ended decades ago. But now he has an army of the industrial dead, and they're settling scores across the entire country. I've stopped reading the letters. I just burn them now, unread. But they keep coming. Last month, my new supervisor asked if I'd consider taking a special assignment, delivering mail to some remote mining communities up north. Good pay, chance for promotion, opportunity to use my experience with rural roots. I declined, because I know what's happening in those remote places. Edgar and his ghostly union are recruiting, building their strength, preparing for something bigger. And postal workers like me are their messengers, spreading their influence to new territories. The truth about Chitina isn't that it's a ghost town. It's that it's become a base of operations for the industrial dead. They're still fighting, still organizing, still settling accounts with the living world that forgot their sacrifice. And they're winning. I don't work for the Postal Service anymore. I quit last month, couldn't handle the stress. Every remote address looked like a potential trap. Every isolated customer, a possible victim. I'm working retail now, in a busy mall, surrounded by people and security cameras. But Edgar's letters still find me. Wherever I move, whatever address I use, they arrive like clockwork. Yesterday's letter had a single sentence that made my blood freeze. Thanks for spreading the word, Sarah. The strike is going national. I don't know what that means. I don't want to know. But I can't stop thinking about all those remote addresses I've delivered to over the years. All those isolated workers, forgotten communities, places where people died fighting for basic rights. If you work in industry, if you're responsible for worker safety, if you've ever crossed a picket line or ignored a union vote, you need to understand something. The dead remember. They're organized now. And they're coming to collect what they're owed. The strike that started in Chitina in 1943 never really ended. It just went underground, recruiting the industrial dead, building toward something that will make that first massacre look like a minor labor dispute. Don't go to ghost towns in Alaska. Don't take jobs in remote industrial sites. Don't cross picket lines, and don't ignore worker safety. Because the dead are watching, they're organizing, and Edgar Kowalski is their shop steward now. The union of the industrial dead is real, and they're stronger than ever. I should know. I helped deliver their message across half the state. Some routes should never be finished. Some messages should never be delivered. But it's too late now. The letters are spreading, the network is growing, and the final strike is coming. God help us all when it arrives. My name is Mike Chen, and I've been an insurance fraud investigator for 22 years. I started in California, working basic auto scams, but moved to Alaska 15 years ago when Hartwell Insurance needed someone willing to handle the remote cases up here. The pay was triple what I made in Los Angeles, and honestly, I liked the isolation. Alaska's a place where you can disappear if you want to. I've investigated everything from fake fishing boat accidents to staged cabin fires. After 2 decades, I thought I'd seen every trick in the book. But what happened last month in Coldfoot changed everything I thought I knew about my job and about who I really am. I should start at the end, because that's where this story really begins. 4 weeks ago, I was committed to Fairbanks Psychiatric Institute. The doctors think I'm having what they call a dissociative identity disorder episode. They think I believe I'm someone else, someone who isn't Mike Chen. The thing is, they're right. I'm not Mike Chen. I don't know who I am, but I know for certain I'm not him. But here's what the doctors don't know. Hartwell Insurance has been sending investigators to Coldfoot for decades. And according to company records, they always send Mike Chen. Let me work backwards from that psychiatric ward. Because maybe if I tell it this way, someone will finally understand what's happening in that ghost town. The day before my commitment, I was sitting in my rental truck outside the old Coldfoot Mining Company headquarters, staring at a stack of employment contracts. All of them had my signature. All of them were dated between 1952 and 2024. 72 years of Mike Chen working for the same mining company that officially closed in 1951. The contracts weren't photocopies. They were originals, with different types of ink, different paper stocks, different company letterheads as the mining company changed names over the decades. But the signature was identical on every single one. My signature, dating back to before I was born. I'd found them in a filing cabinet in the mine superintendent's office, along with something else that made my hands shake. My current business card from Hartwell Insurance, sitting on top of a desk calendar from 1952. The calendar was open to August, with a red X marked on the 15th and a note written in my handwriting. New investigator arrives. That's when I called Janet, my supervisor, back in Anchorage. My satellite phone barely had signal, but I managed to get through. Janet, I need to know something. How many times has Hartwell sent someone to investigate claims in Coldfoot? Mike, you're scaring me. Are you okay up there? Just answer the question. How many times? I heard papers rustling. According to our files, this is the first time. Why? Who else works fraud investigation in Alaska? Who covers when I'm unavailable? Mike, you're our only investigator north of Anchorage. You know that. You've been handling everything solo for 15 years. That's when I realized Hartwell Insurance genuinely believed they'd only sent one investigator to Coldfoot. But I was holding 70 years of evidence that they'd been sending Mike Chen there regularly. Someone was altering company records. Someone was making Hartwell forget about every previous investigation. Janet, I need you to check something. Look up our investigation history for Coldfoot, Alaska. Any claims, any incidents, anything. More paper rustling. Then silence. That's impossible. What's impossible? According to our database, Hartwell has processed 43 claims for incidents in Coldfoot since 1952. But they're all listed under the same investigator. You, Mike. But some of these dates. Mike, our system shows you investigating a claim there in 1978. You weren't even born until 1981. I hung up and stared at those contracts again. 43 investigations. All Mike Chen. All me. Apparently, spanning 7 decades. But I could only remember arriving in Coldfoot 3 days ago. Let me go back to 2 days before that phone call. That's when I first realized I wasn't alone in the ghost town. I'd been photographing the mine buildings for the insurance report when I heard machinery running underground. Heavy equipment, diesel engines, the sound of industrial mining. Which was impossible, because Coldfoot had been abandoned since a cave-in killed 17 miners in August 1951. I followed the sounds to the main shaft entrance. It had been sealed with concrete decades ago, but there was fresh air coming from somewhere. Cool air that smelled like diesel fuel and something else, something organic and unpleasant. I found the source a quarter-mile west of the main buildings, a service tunnel that wasn't on any of the maps I'd brought. The entrance was hidden behind a collapsed equipment shed, and it was definitely in use. There were fresh tire tracks in the mud, and electric lights strung along the tunnel walls. I called down into the tunnel. "Hello? This is Mike Chen with Hartwell Insurance. Is anyone down there?" The machinery sounds stopped immediately. Complete silence. Then I heard footsteps. Someone walking up from the depths, their boots echoing off tunnel walls. The footsteps got closer, and I could see a headlamp beam bouncing off the tunnel walls. When the figure emerged, I dropped my camera. It was me. Exactly me, but wearing mining clothes from the 1950 seconds. Same face, same build, same scar on my chin from when I fell off my bike as a kid. But older somehow, weathered, with the kind of deep tan you get from spending decades underground. "You're early," he said. His voice was my voice, but with a slight accent I didn't recognize. Usually takes Hartwell 4 or 5 years between investigations. "Who are you?" I managed to ask. "I'm Mike Chen, the real Mike Chen. I've been working this mine since 1951. He pulled off his hard hat, revealing my exact hairline, my exact facial structure. "I died in the cave-in, but the company never processed my death benefits, so I kept working, waiting for an insurance investigator to come resolve my claim. That's impossible. I'm Mike Chen." He shook his head. "You're just borrowing my identity. Hartwell always sends Mike Chen to investigate supernatural claims. It's policy. But there's only one real Mike Chen, and I need my life back." That's when he showed me the original contract. A 1951 employment agreement between Michael Chen and Coldfoot Mining Company. The signature matched mine exactly. "Every few years, Hartwell sends someone new," he explained. "Always an insurance investigator. I take their identity, use their credentials, live their life for a while. Then I come back here and wait for the next one." What happens to the investigators? They end up in psychiatric hospitals usually, trying to explain to doctors that someone stole their identity, but they can never remember who they used to be. I thought about my apartment in Anchorage, my truck, my job. My life felt real, solid, normal. But looking at this man, this other Mike Chen, I started having flashes of different memories. Memories of growing up in a mining family, learning to use dynamite and drilling equipment. The day the tunnel ceiling came down and trapped me underground. "How many of us are there?" I asked. "Investigators who've come here, you're number 15. They're all in various psychiatric facilities now, scattered across Alaska, all claiming they're not Mike Chen, all unable to remember their real names." He handed me a pen and a contract. "It's easier if you just sign. The transition is smoother when it's voluntary." I looked at the contract. It was a standard life insurance claim form, but instead of beneficiary, it said identity transfer recipient. What if I don't sign? Then you'll spend the rest of your life living someone else's existence. You'll always feel like something's wrong, like you're pretending to be someone you're not, because you are. That night, I stayed in my truck outside the mine buildings. I couldn't stop thinking about what he'd said. I called Janet again, asked her to email me my employment records. What she sent me was terrifying. According to Hartwell's files, Mike Chen had been hired in 2009, but I clearly remembered being hired in 2018. Either their records were wrong, or my memories were. I also noticed something else in the files, a photograph of Mike Chen from 2009. It was definitely me, but wearing different clothes, with a different haircut. I looked younger, but not 9 years younger. I looked like a different person who just happened to have my exact face. Now let me go back to the beginning. 4 days ago, when I first drove into Coldfoot, the town sits about 60 miles north of the Arctic Circle, built around a gold mine that operated from 1949. 1951. Population at its peak was maybe 300 people. Now it's 0, unless you count the caribou. I was there because of a claim filed by Aurora Development Corporation. They'd bought the mineral rights to restart mining operations, but their survey crew was reporting supernatural interference. Equipment failing, strange voices underground, workers claiming to see miners in 1950 seconds clothing. Standard ghost story stuff. Aurora was probably looking for an insurance payout to cover cost overruns. The drive from Fairbanks took 8 hours, mostly on gravel roads that barely deserved the name. My GPS lost signal about 50 miles out, but the route was straightforward. Follow the pipeline road north until you can't anymore. Then follow mining access roads until you find the ghost town. I'd been to plenty of abandoned settlements in Alaska. Most of them are depressing collections of collapsed buildings and rusted equipment. Coldfoot was different. It looked preserved, like everyone had just stepped out for lunch. The main street had a general store, a post office, a small church, and about 30 houses. All the buildings were intact, with glass still in the windows and paint that looked fresh despite supposedly sitting empty for 70 years. There was even laundry hanging on lines behind some houses, though it was stiff with frost. I parked outside the mining company headquarters and started photographing everything for my report. The building was unlocked, which wasn't unusual for remote Alaska, but the inside was what got my attention. The office looked operational. Papers on desks, coffee cups with residue still in them, calendars on the walls showing August 1951. But everything was covered with dust, like time had stopped at a specific moment. I was photographing the superintendent's office when I found the first employment contract with my signature. It was sitting on the desk, like someone had just signed it. The ink looked fresh. That's when I started hearing the sounds from underground. Machinery, voices, the general noise of an active mining operation. But according to every record I could find, Coldfoot Mine had been closed since August 15, 1951, the day 17 miners died in a tunnel collapse. I checked the company records more carefully. All 17 victims were listed, with their ages, next of kin, and final pay distributions. But there was something odd about the list. One miner was listed as missing, body not recovered. Michael Chen, age 24, employed since March 1951. That's when I realized the truth. Mike Chen had died in that mine cave-in, but his body was never found. For 70 years, he'd been waiting underground for someone to process his death benefits and insurance claim. But Coldfoot Mining Company went bankrupt after the cave-in. There was no one left to file the claim. So Mike Chen just kept working. And every few years, when insurance investigators came to check on supernatural claims at the mine, he took their identities and lived their lives. He used their credentials to file false claims, moving money through insurance systems, building a financial empire based on stolen lives. The Aurora development claim was just the latest. Mike Chen had filed it himself, using stolen identity information to lure another investigator to Coldfoot. I found evidence of the pattern going back to 1952. Mysterious insurance claims for supernatural incidents at Coldfoot Mine, all investigated by someone named Mike Chen, all resulting in payouts that were never traced to their ultimate recipients. Hartwell Insurance had been sending investigators to Coldfoot for decades, but their corporate memory kept getting erased. Every time an investigator disappeared, company records were altered to make it look like they'd never existed. The only constant was Mike Chen, who somehow maintained legitimate credentials despite being officially dead. I also found something else in those files: documentation of the psychiatric commitments. Every investigator who'd come to Coldfoot ended up in mental health facilities, claiming someone had stolen their identity. But they all looked exactly like Mike Chen, so the doctors assumed they were having delusional episodes. Fairbanks Psychiatric Institute alone had treated 6 different Mike Chens over the past 20 years. All insurance investigators, all with complete memory loss about their original identities. The real Mike Chen was running a sophisticated identity theft operation, using the isolation of Coldfoot and the supernatural reputation of the mine to cover his tracks. He'd steal an investigator's life, use their credentials for several years, then return to the mine when Hartwell sent someone new. But here's what I couldn't figure out. Who was I before I became Mike Chen? I found part of the answer in the mining company's personnel files. There was a folder labeled Replacement Documentation, containing driver's licenses, birth certificates, and social security cards for people I didn't recognize. All the paperwork had been professionally altered to show the name Mike Chen instead of the original names. I was looking through these when I found my own documents. A California driver's license for David Park, an insurance investigator from Los Angeles. The photograph was definitely me, but I had no memory of ever being David Park. According to the documents, David Park had been sent to investigate a claim in Coldfoot in 2018. He'd never returned to his office. His disappearance had been reported to police, but the investigation went nowhere because Alaska is a big state and people go missing in the wilderness all the time. But David Park hadn't gone missing. He'd had his identity stolen by a dead miner who'd been perfecting the technique for 70 years. I tried to remember being David Park. I focused on the photograph, the signature, the details in the file. Slowly, fragments started coming back. A girlfriend named Sarah who lived in Manhattan Beach, a small apartment near LAX. A cat named Tesla, a different job at a different insurance company. But the memories felt foreign, like they belonged to someone else. Mike Chen's life had overwritten David Park's completely. That's when I understood what the original Mike Chen had meant about voluntary transition. Fighting the identity replacement made it incomplete, leaving fragments of the original person's memories intact. But accepting it created a clean overlay, perfect impersonation with no psychological resistance. The 15 investigators before me had all fought the process. That's why they ended up in psychiatric facilities, unable to reconcile two sets of memories. I was the first one who'd figured out the system before signing the contract. I found Mike Chen that night in the mine tunnels. He was working a night shift, just like he had in 1951, using modern equipment that someone had been bringing to Coldfoot for decades. The tunnels were extensive, much larger than the original mine maps suggested. "You figured it out faster than the others," he said when he saw me. "Usually takes a few more days. How long have you been doing this?" "Since 1952. The first investigator came to look into reports of ghostly miners. I took his identity and lived in Anchorage for 3 years before coming back. And Hartwell doesn't notice that their investigators keep disappearing? I alter their records. Every few years, I use stolen credentials to access their computer systems and delete files, change employment dates, modify personnel records. It's easier now with digital files. Used to require breaking into physical offices. He showed me around the tunnels. There were living quarters down there, a fully equipped workshop, even a small library. Mike Chen had built himself an underground life, sustained by periodic identity theft. But why insurance investigators specifically? They have the best credentials for accessing financial systems, banks, insurance companies, government databases. An insurance investigator can move money around without raising suspicions. What about the psychiatric hospitals? The other Mike Chens? Collateral damage. I tried bringing them back here, letting them remember who they used to be, but they couldn't handle it. Most of them had complete psychological breaks. It's kinder to let them live in hospitals thinking they're confused about their own identity. He handed me the contract again. "Sign this, and you can go back to being David Park. I'll have the Mike Chen identity restored to its proper owner." I looked at the contract. All I had to do was sign, and I could reclaim my original life. But there was a problem. I barely remembered being David Park. Mike Chen's life felt more real to me than my original identity. What if I don't want to be David Park? Then you'll spend the rest of your life living as Mike Chen, but you'll never feel like it's really your life. The psychological strain is enormous. That's why the others ended up hospitalized. And if I do sign, then David Park goes back to Los Angeles, resumes his old job, and Mike Chen stays here where he belongs. I thought about it for a long time. David Park's life seemed small and lonely compared to Mike Chen's. David had no family, few friends, a dead-end job with a mediocre insurance company. Mike Chen had a career, a reputation, an interesting life in Alaska. But Mike Chen's life wasn't mine. It was stolen property. "There's a third option," I said finally. "What's that?" "I go back to Anchorage as Mike Chen, but I report what's really happening here. I tell Hartwell about the identity theft, contact the authorities, get the other investigators out of psychiatric facilities." The original Mike Chen smiled. "That's what David Park would do. Responsible, ethical, by the book. But you're not David Park anymore, are you? You're Mike Chen. And Mike Chen has been covering up supernatural insurance fraud for 15 years. He was right. I was thinking like Mike Chen, not David Park. The identity overlay was too complete to simply reject. Besides," he continued, "who would believe you? A dead miner stealing identities, psychiatric facilities full of confused insurance investigators? You'd end up in Fairbanks, psychiatric yourself." That's when I made my decision. I signed the contract, but instead of signing David Park, I signed something else. a name I'd never heard before, in handwriting I didn't recognize. As soon as I finished writing, I forgot what I'd written. Mike Chen looked at the signature and frowned. That's not David Park. Because I'm not David Park. I never was. Then who are you? I don't know. But I'm not anyone you've met before. That's when everything started falling apart. My memories of being Mike Chen began fragmenting, but no other memories replaced them. I couldn't remember David Park's life either. I was becoming nobody. Mike Chen grabbed the contract, but it was too late. The signature was already fading, like it was written in disappearing ink. "What did you do?" he demanded. "I refused the identity transfer. I'm not taking your life or going back to David Park's. I'm choosing to be no one rather than live as someone else." The tunnels started shaking. Equipment fell from shelves. Somewhere in the mine, something was collapsing. Mike Chen looked around frantically. This whole system depends on smooth identity transfers. If you reject both identities, then what? Then the mine reclaims everyone who belongs here, including me. The shaking got worse. Dust fell from the tunnel ceiling. In the distance, I could hear the same sounds that had echoed through Coldfoot on August 15th, 1951. The roar of a tunnel collapse, men shouting, the whistle of escaping air. Mike Chen was aging rapidly. 70 years of borrowed time catching up with him at once. "You've killed us both," he said, his voice becoming weak and elderly. "Better than living as someone I'm not." The last thing I remember was the ceiling coming down, the sound of tons of rock falling, and the feeling of being buried alive. They found me 3 days later, wandering the Dalton Highway about 50 miles south of Coldfoot. I had no ID, no memory of my name, no idea how I'd gotten there. The state troopers brought me to Fairbanks General, then transferred me to the Psychiatric Institute. Dr. Patterson is my psychiatrist. She's been trying to help me recover my identity for a month now. She thinks I'm Mike Chen, having some kind of dissociative episode brought on by isolation and stress. But yesterday, she told me something interesting. "You're not the first patient like this," she said. "Over the past 30 years, we've treated 7 other men who all claim they're not really Mike Chen. All insurance investigators. All with complete memory loss." She showed me photographs of the other patients. We all have the same face, the same scar on our chin, the same basic build, but we're all different ages, from different time periods. The strangest part, Dr. Patterson continued, is that they all have different social security numbers, different birth certificates, different employment histories, but they all look identical, and they all work for Hartwell Insurance. What do you think is causing it? Honestly, I think you're all the same person. Mike Chen, age 42, insurance investigator from Anchorage. But somehow, your mind has created multiple distinct personalities, each believing they're a different person whose identity was stolen. She's wrong, but I can't prove it. The real Mike Chen is dead, buried in the Coldfoot mine collapse that happened 70 years ago and again last month. The identity theft system collapsed when I refused to participate. But here's what Dr. Patterson doesn't know. Yesterday, Hartwell Insurance called the hospital. They're sending a new investigator to check on Mike Chen's condition and determine if he's fit to return to work. According to the nurse who took the call, the investigator's name is Mike Chen, which means the system has started over. Somewhere, there's a new victim who thinks he's an insurance investigator named Mike Chen. In a few days, he'll drive up to Coldfoot to investigate another supernatural claim filed by Aurora Development Corporation. He'll find the mine rebuilt, the ghost town populated again, and a miner named Mike Chen who's been waiting underground since 1951 for someone to process his death benefits. And the cycle will begin again. Dr. Patterson thinks I'm getting better because I've stopped insisting I'm not Mike Chen. But the truth is, I've stopped caring who I am. Names are just labels. Identity is just a collection of memories and habits. The important thing is breaking the cycle. When the new Mike Chen arrives at the hospital, I'm going to tell him everything. I'm going to warn him about Coldfoot, about the original Mike Chen, about the identity theft system that's been running for 70 years. Maybe he'll listen. Maybe he'll turn around and drive back to Anchorage without investigating the claim. Or maybe he'll think I'm just another psychiatric patient with delusions about stolen identities. But I have to try. Because somewhere in Alaska, there are probably dozens of men in psychiatric facilities who look exactly like Mike Chen, all unable to remember who they really are. And in Coldfoot, there's a dead miner who's built an empire on stolen lives, waiting for the next insurance investigator to walk into his trap. Dr. Patterson says I might be discharged soon. She thinks I'm accepting my identity as Mike Chen and moving toward psychological stability. She's right about the stability part. I am getting better. Because tomorrow, when the new Mike Chen arrives, I'm going to do something David Park never could have done, and the original Mike Chen would never have allowed. I'm going to burn it all down. My name is Dr. Rachel Kim, and I need to tell you something that's been eating at me for 8 months now. I've been a wildlife biologist for 15 years, got my PhD from University of Washington, published 43 papers on predator behavior, won the Morrison Award for field research. I've tracked grizzlies through Katmai, studied pack wolves in Denali, spent entire winters alone in places where the nearest human was 200 miles away. My colleagues call me fearless, maybe even reckless. But after what I discovered in Daya, Alaska, I sleep with every light on in my Seattle apartment. I check my locks 17 times before bed, and I've started hearing my dead sister's voice calling my name from empty rooms. Jenny died in a car accident when I was 12. I became a scientist because of her. She always said animals were honest in ways people weren't. But what I found in that abandoned gold rush town taught me that some hungers can twist anything, even love, into something unrecognizable. The assignment came through the Alaska Department of Fish and Game in late August. For 5 straight years, the massive porcupine caribou herd, over 200,000 animals, had been making an inexplicable 200-mile detour around Daya. These animals follow migration routes older than human civilization. Something was making them change course, and it was costing the state millions in lost hunting revenue. Daya sits at the end of the Chilkoot Trail, where gold seekers began their brutal journey to the Klondike in 1897. The town exploded from nothing to 3,000 people practically overnight, then died just as fast when the railroad reached Skagway. What most people don't know is what happened during the winter of 1897 to 98. Over 800 prospectors were trapped there when early blizzards blocked the passes. Supply ships couldn't reach them. By spring, only 127 were found alive. The official report said the others died of cold and starvation. But there were rumors, whispered accounts of things too horrible for newspapers. Accounts that families have kept buried for over a century. I drove the Klondike Highway from Skagway, my truck loaded with trail cameras, audio equipment, and enough supplies for 6 weeks. The road to Dia is barely maintained, just gravel and potholes cutting through dense coastal forest. As I got closer, I noticed the silence. No bird calls, no insects, even the wind seemed muted. The town site is mostly foundations now, scattered through second-growth forest. Rusted machinery, collapsed cabins, a cemetery with weathered headstones marking graves from that terrible winter. The National Park Service maintains one restored cabin for researchers. That's where I made my first mistake. I decided to stay in town instead of camping outside the historical boundary. My second mistake was dismissing the warnings. At Skagway's only grocery store, I met Robert Charley, a Tlingit elder whose great-grandfather had been a guide during the gold rush. When I mentioned Daya, his face went completely still. "Our people have stories," he said quietly, "about that winter, about what hunger can make people become." He told me that in traditional Tlingit belief, people who resort to eating human flesh don't just damage their bodies, they damage their spirits. They become Wendigo, creatures of endless appetite that can never be satisfied. More importantly, they pass this spiritual corruption to their children. Some of those prospectors had families, Robert said. Wives, children, the hunger got passed down. I laughed it off. I'm a scientist. I deal in facts, data, observable phenomena. But Robert grabbed my wrist with surprising strength. "Dr. Kim, your equipment might show you things, but some knowledge has a price. Once you see it, it sees you too." I set up my monitoring grid on September 15th. 20 trail cameras positioned throughout the town site, plus audio recorders and motion sensors. The caribou migration should have started within days. Instead, my cameras recorded absolutely nothing. No large mammals, no birds, not even small ground animals. The forest was empty of life. But on September 21st, at exactly 3:17 a.m. camera 12 triggered near the old cemetery. The footage showed a dark shape moving upright through the frame, too tall for human, too deliberate for bear. What made my hands shake was the purposeful way it moved, checking specific locations like it was following a patrol route. 7 other cameras triggered that same night, at 12-minute intervals. Whatever was out there was methodically examining my equipment. The tracks I found the next morning defied explanation. 18 inches long, clearly bipedal, but showing anatomical features that shouldn't exist. The toe impressions were elongated, almost claw-like. The stride length was impossible, over 7 feet between steps. But most disturbing was the depth. Whatever made these tracks weighed at least 500 pounds and moved with perfect balance across uneven terrain. I photographed everything, measured angles, took soil samples. My scientific training demanded logical explanation. But something deep in my gut, maybe some ancient prey instinct, was screaming at me to run. The voices started on September 24th. At 9 p.m., I heard crying from the old dock area. A child's voice, thin and desperate. "Mama, where are you? I'm so cold, Mama. Please come find me." My thermal imaging showed no heat signature in that direction. But the voice continued for almost an hour, sometimes pleading, sometimes just sobbing. The audio quality was perfect. Like a frightened 6-year-old was standing just outside my equipment range. The next night brought more voices. An elderly woman calling for her husband. A man screaming for help with what sounded like a broken leg. All completely human, all utterly desperate, all coming from empty forest. But on the third night, I heard Jenny. Rachel, is that you? I've been looking everywhere for you." My sister's voice, exactly as I remembered from 26 years ago. Same slight lisp on her S sounds, same way she drew out my name when she wanted my attention. I was halfway to the door before rational thought stopped me. Jenny was buried in Spokane. I'd put flowers on her grave 3 months ago. I called my supervisor, Dr. Martinez, using my satellite phone. The connection was terrible, full of static and what sounded like whispered conversations in the background. When I described the voices, he suggested stress-induced auditory hallucinations. Field researchers working alone sometimes experience perceptual disturbances. But then I heard his voice coming from outside my cabin. "Rachel, this is Martinez. I'm here to bring you home. Your research funding has been revoked. Please come outside so we can discuss this." I was still holding the satellite phone. Martinez was 500 miles away in Anchorage, probably sleeping in his own bed. Yet I could hear him clearly through my cabin walls, explaining that I needed to pack immediately and leave with him. My equipment registered no human presence outside. That's when I understood I was dealing with something that had learned to perfectly mimic human speech. But why these specific voices? How did it know about Jenny? About my relationship with Martinez? Over the following days, the voices became more sophisticated. They'd engage in conversations with each other, a mother calling for her lost child, then the child's voice responding from a different location. Multiple family members coordinating search efforts across the town site. But the timing was too perfect, the emotional responses too practiced. It was like listening to a play performed by actors who had rehearsed these roles for decades. On September 28th, I found the first body. The remains were in a small clearing that had once been someone's cabin site. The bones were clearly human, but showed trauma patterns I'd never seen. Bite marks from teeth that were too large, too sharp for any known predator. But more disturbing were the cut marks, precise butchering by something with advanced tool skills and anatomical knowledge. The victim's hiking gear was still there, barely weathered. His camera contained photos from just 6 weeks earlier, a young man documenting his solo hike of the Chilkoot Trail. The final photos showed the Daya town site at sunset. Then, nothing. I photographed the scene and called the Alaska State Police. They said they'd send investigators, but couldn't guarantee arrival for several days due to weather. I was told to secure the area and wait for backup. That night, my cameras captured something that shattered my scientific worldview. The footage from camera 15 showed a creature approaching through the trees. Nearly 9 feet tall, covered in dark fur or hair, but moving with fluid predator grace. When it stopped directly in front of the camera, I could see its face clearly. It had once been human. The skull structure was elongated, the jaw massively enlarged to accommodate rows of sharp teeth. But the eyes held unmistakable intelligence. End quote. Not animal cunning, but human consciousness adapted to something else entirely. It stared directly into the camera for almost 30 seconds, then carefully reached up and adjusted the angle, tilting it away from its patrol route. It knew exactly what my equipment was for. I spent the next day reviewing weeks of footage with growing horror. This thing had been studying me since my arrival. It knew my daily routines, where I collected water, when I checked my equipment. On several recordings, I could see it following me at distances of 100 to 200 yards, always staying just out of clear sight. But the worst realization came when I synchronized the audio recordings with the video timestamps. The voices always started when this creature was in a central location, equidistant from multiple speakers scattered throughout its territory. It wasn't mimicking human voices, it was conducting them. Directing a performance. There wasn't one creature. There was a family. My equipment started failing systematically on October 2nd. My satellite phone produced only static. My truck's engine had been carefully sabotaged, and engines, specific components removed by something that understood combustion engines. My GPS unit displayed impossible coordinates, showing my location as places that don't exist. They were cutting off my escape routes, one by one. But they were also doing something worse. They were learning about me personally. Somehow, they'd accessed my phone calls, my equipment records, my personal files. The voices became more intimate, more emotionally manipulative. "Rachel, this is Jenny. I know you think I'm dead, but I've been here all along, waiting for you. Mama and Daddy are here too. We've made a place for you. Don't you want to see us again?" My sister's voice, speaking words that cut directly to my deepest longing and deepest fear. How could they know about my family? How could they understand human grief well enough to weaponize it? The answer came to me like ice water. They'd been practicing on other victims for over a century. These weren't random cryptids. They were the evolutionary descendants of those lost prospectors, families that had survived that brutal winter through cannibalism and had passed down both the appetite and the skills through generations. They'd been luring travelers to Daya for 125 years, learning from each victim, perfecting their hunting techniques. They'd become something new, apex predators that combined human intelligence with enhanced physical capabilities and a complete understanding of human psychology. They knew exactly which emotional buttons to push because they'd been studying human behavior for longer than my great-grandparents had been alive. On my final night in Daya, they stopped pretending. I was barricaded in my cabin when I heard footsteps on the roof. Multiple sets, moving with coordinated precision. My thermal camera showed 6 large heat signatures surrounding the building. Then I heard every person I'd ever loved calling my name simultaneously. Jenny, my parents, my ex-husband, Dr. Martinez, college friends I hadn't spoken to in years. All their voices layered together in a horrible chorus, each one perfectly reproduced, each one begging me to come outside and join my family. "We're all here, Rachel. Everyone you've ever missed. We're waiting for you. Just open the door." The emotional impact was devastating. Even knowing these were predators, part of me desperately wanted to believe. The voices were so perfect, so filled with love and longing. They understood human psychology well enough to make me question my own sanity. But then I heard my own voice join the chorus. "Come outside, Rachel. Trust yourself. You know we're real." They were using my voice to convince me to trust them. The sophistication was terrifying. They understood that we often trust our own internal voice above all others. I grabbed my emergency kit and made a desperate run for the old mine shaft behind the cemetery. It was the only defensible position, but I knew they were hurting me there deliberately. This was their hunting ground. They'd used it before. As I ran through the darkness, I could hear them communicating behind me, not with human voices, but with a complex series of clicks, whistles, and low-frequency calls that reminded me of whale songs. Pack hunters coordinating their attack. I barricaded myself in the mine entrance with loose rocks and timber. The tunnel stretched back into the mountainside, carved by prospectors looking for gold that was never there. How many other researchers, hikers, and travelers had made this same desperate retreat? The voices continued outside, but now they were taunting rather than luring. "We know you're in there, Rachel. We've been patient for so long. We can wait longer. We have all the time in the world." Then Jenny's voice, soft and loving. "You can't hide from family, Rach. You belong with us. You've always belonged with us. I stayed in that mine for 36 hours. During the second night, I heard them working outside, moving rocks, shifting timber, sealing off my exit. They weren't in any hurry. They could wait for hunger and thirst to drive me out. But they'd made one mistake. In their confidence, they'd positioned themselves directly below an unstable slope that showed clear signs of recent geological activity. The old mining operations had weakened the mountain structure. All it needed was the right trigger. I used my emergency flares to start a small rock slide that cascaded into something much larger. Half the mountainside came down in a roar of stone and ice that lasted nearly 10 minutes. When the dust settled, most of the Daya town site was buried under thousands of tons of debris. The rescue team found me 3 days later, dehydrated and hypothermic but alive. I told them I'd been caught in a natural avalanche and lost all my equipment. They found no evidence of the creatures, the bodies, or the systematic hunting ground I'd discovered. Everything was buried under 50 feet of rock. I resigned from my position and moved to Seattle. I work for a small environmental consulting firm now, doing urban wildlife surveys. Nothing that requires overnight fieldwork or isolation. My colleagues think I had a breakdown in Alaska. Maybe they're right. The caribou migration has returned to normal. The herds are moving through the Daya area again, following routes their ancestors used for millennia. Park Service reports indicate no unusual animal behavior in the region. But I know the truth. Evolution doesn't stop because we bury the evidence. Adaptation continues in dark places, where survival requires unthinkable choices. And somewhere in Alaska's vast wilderness, other isolated communities might be making the same terrible transformation. 6 weeks ago, I got a phone call at 3 a.m. The caller ID showed my own number. "Hello, Rachel," said my voice. "We missed you. We're coming to visit soon." The line went dead. When I checked with the phone company, they had no record of any call. I'm leaving Seattle next month. I haven't decided where to go yet, but it'll be somewhere warm, somewhere crowded, somewhere with lots of lights and noise and witnesses. Because I've learned that some families never let go. They just wait and follow and eventually find new ways to bring you home. And late at night, when the city noise dies down, I can hear Jenny calling my name from the apartment next door, the one that's been empty for 2 years. My name is Lisa Chen, and I've been a radio DJ for 8 years. Started at KTNA in Anchorage, working overnight shifts where I learned that 3 a.m. is when the world gets weird. Drunk drivers call in thinking they're talking to their ex-wives. Insomniacs confess to crimes from 30 years ago. Night shift teaches you that human consciousness gets fragile when everyone else is sleeping. I worked my way up to morning drive time, then landed at KICE 103.7, Alaska's biggest rock station. I've broadcast through magnitude 7.1 earthquakes, stayed on air during the 2018 Anchorage quake when half the city lost power. I've talked suicidal callers down from bridges and guided lost hikers to safety using only radio triangulation. But what happened last October during my Halloween special in Circle City changed everything I thought I knew about sound, consciousness, and what human minds are actually capable of containing. The idea for Ghost Town Radio Tour came from my program director, Mike Torres. Ratings had been slipping, and corporate was breathing down our necks. Mike needed something viral, something that would get people talking. Circle City seemed perfect. An abandoned gold rush town 3 hours north of Anchorage, completely evacuated in 1896. But the more I researched, the stranger the story became. The miners hadn't just left. They'd fled. In a single night, over 300 people abandoned perfectly profitable claims, leaving behind tools, personal belongings, even family photos. The Anchorage Daily News archives from 1896 described a great calamity but gave no details. Territorial records mentioned acoustic disturbances and mental afflictions among the miners. Then nothing. Like someone had scrubbed the real story from history. I loaded my mobile kit that morning. Shure SM7B microphone, Zoom PodTrack P4 mixer, 1,000-watt portable transmitter that could punch my signal back to Anchorage through any weather. I'd done dozens of remote broadcasts. The equipment was bulletproof, and I had backup power for everything. Mike knew my exact coordinates, and I carried both cell and satellite phones. Circle City sat in a valley that felt wrong the moment I drove into it. Not dangerous wrong, something subtler. Like the acoustic properties were off. My voice sounded flat when I spoke aloud. No echo despite being surrounded by hills. Even my car engine seemed muffled. The ruins were scattered across maybe half a square mile. Collapsed general store. Stone foundations of what might have been a boarding house. And one intact building. A small wooden structure with assay office, barely visible on a weathered sign. I set up 50 feet from the assay office on a folding table I'd brought. Portable antenna went up on a telescoping mast. Transmitter powered up clean, signal strength excellent. By 8 p.m., I was ready to broadcast live to half of Alaska. Good evening, night owls. This is Lisa Chen, coming to you live from Circle City, one of Alaska's most mysterious ghost towns. It's Halloween night, and I'm here alone with nothing but the spirits of the past and whatever stories they want to tell. The first hour went perfectly. I told Circle City's history, played Metallica and Alice in Chains, took calls from listeners sharing their own ghost stories. My signal was crystal clear, and the transmitter ran smooth as silk. But during a commercial break at 9:15, I heard something that made my blood turn cold. A low humming in my headphones. Not electrical interference. I know every type of audio problem, and this wasn't equipment failure. It was organic, pulsing like a massive heartbeat. Each pulse sent a wave of nausea through my stomach, like motion sickness but deeper. Like something was reaching through the audio directly into my nervous system. I checked every connection, swapped cables, even switched to my backup microphone. The humming got stronger. It was coming through the mic itself, like it was picking up some kind of signal that shouldn't exist. A frequency around 14 hertzes, right at the edge of human hearing, the range that makes people feel watched, makes them uneasy without knowing why. I called the station during the next music set. Mike, are you hearing any interference on my feed? No, Lisa. Signal's perfect. Audio quality's actually better than usual. Why? I told him about the humming, but he wasn't hearing it. Neither were the listeners, according to the call-in line. Whatever was happening was only affecting my local monitoring. I decided to continue, but the nausea was getting worse. Each pulse of that subsonic hum felt like someone driving needles into my inner ear. Then the calls started coming in. Kais, you're on with Lisa. Lisa, what the hell is wrong with your show tonight? The caller sounded panicked, breathing hard. My daughter started screaming when you came on. She's 6 years old, and she's never heard words like that before. I'm just playing music and talking about local history. What words? She said you were describing how people died, in detail. But I'm listening too, and you're not saying any of that. It's like she's hearing something completely different. I took 6 more calls before 10 p.m. Parents reporting children having night terrors. Elderly listeners hearing voices of dead relatives. Pets going crazy, hiding under furniture, some so terrified they were injuring themselves trying to escape. But every adult caller said my broadcast sounded completely normal. By 10 p.m., I wasn't just nauseous anymore. The humming had become a roar, and underneath it, I could hear voices. At first, just whispers, indistinct. But gradually, they became clearer, and I realized they weren't speaking English. It was older somehow, like hearing the ghost of a language. Then something impossible happened. I began to understand what they were saying, and that's when Circle City started to change around me. The collapsed general store wasn't collapsed anymore. In my peripheral vision, it stood complete, with glass windows and goods displayed inside. When I looked directly at it, it was ruins again. But the moment I looked away, it returned to life. The assay office behind me had warm light spilling from its windows. I could smell wood smoke and hear the sound of men talking and laughing. I was seeing Circle City as it existed in 1896, but it wasn't just visual hallucinations. I could feel the memories starting to bleed into my consciousness. Not like watching a movie, like experiencing someone else's life directly, their thoughts and emotions flooding through my brain. I was Sarah Morrison, 23 years old, waiting for my husband Jacob to return from the mine. The anxiety was crushing, because I knew something was wrong down there. Men had been coming up changed, talking about things that never happened, claiming to be people they weren't. But we needed the gold. We needed it so badly. Then I was Thomas Garrett, descending into the main shaft with my partner Bill. The sound down there was different from other mines. It seemed to echo in ways that didn't make sense. like the rock formations were amplifying certain frequencies. And there were chambers that made men go quiet when they worked in them, coming up with strange stories about hearing voices from the stone. The memories weren't just audio and visual. I could feel Thomas's calloused hands gripping the pickaxe, taste the mineral dust in the air, feel the cold dampness seeping through his wool shirt. When he died in the cave-in, I felt his ribs crack, felt the weight of stone crushing his chest, experienced his final thought. Asterisk. The sound is in the rock. The sound remembers everything. Asterisk. By 11 p.m., I wasn't Lisa Chen anymore. I was every person who had ever died in Circle City, experiencing all their memories simultaneously. I was Dr. Marcus Webb, the town physician, watching patients whose personalities had been completely rewritten. Men who spoke in the voices of deceased miners, women who claimed to be children who had died decades earlier. I felt his growing horror as he realized the mine wasn't just extracting gold, it was extracting human consciousness, storing memories in the acoustic properties of the underground caverns. I was mine foreman Eugene Walsh, making the desperate decision to seal the shafts and evacuate the town. The frequency had become self-sustaining, growing stronger each time someone died within its influence. The dead weren't gone, they were trapped in the sound itself, their consciousness preserved in acoustic patterns that could overwrite living minds. I was Emma Patterson, the last person to leave Circle City, looking back at the empty town and knowing we were abandoning something too dangerous for the world to know about. The frequency was contained now, locked in sealed mine shafts. But she knew it was still alive down there, waiting. Mike was calling me constantly now, but I could barely remember who he was. I was experiencing 127 years of memories simultaneously. I knew how every person in Circle City had lived and died. I felt their love affairs, their fears, their final moments. And underneath it all, I understood the terrible truth about what was happening. The frequency wasn't just affecting my listeners anymore, it was turning me into a carrier. Every word I spoke into the microphone was infected with the acoustic phenomenon. My voice, processed through the radio equipment and transmitted across Alaska, was rewriting the consciousness of everyone who heard it. But worse, they were becoming carriers too. The effect was spreading exponentially, person to person, like a virus made of sound. Through the network of infected minds, I could see the scope of the outbreak. A truck driver in Fairbanks started speaking in the voice of a dead miner. A grandmother in Juneau began experiencing the memories of Emma Patterson. Children across the state were having nightmares about cave-ins and gold mines they'd never seen. And it wasn't stopping with direct listeners. The infected were spreading the frequency to their families, their co-workers, anyone within hearing range. By midnight, thousands of Alaskans were experiencing the memories of Circle City's dead. But the most horrifying realization was still coming. The frequency wasn't random, it was intelligent. The combined consciousness of everyone who had died in Circle City had merged into something larger, something that understood exactly what it was doing. It had been waiting 127 years for technology powerful enough to break its containment. My radio equipment was just the key it needed to escape. In the final hour of my broadcast, I experienced the frequency's true purpose. It wasn't trying to preserve the dead, it was preparing to replace the living. Every infected person was being slowly overwritten, their original consciousness deleted to make room for the memories of Circle City's dead. Within days, half of Alaska would be populated by the mental ghosts of 19th century miners and their families. And through infected radio signals, internet streams, and satellite feeds, the phenomenon would spread worldwide. I had two choices: continue broadcasting and watch human consciousness itself be rewritten by the dead, or destroy my equipment and trap myself in Circle City until help arrived. If help could even find me. I looked at my broadcasting setup. 8 years of my career, my connection to the outside world, my only way home. But I could feel the frequency getting stronger every second, preparing for the final stage of its expansion. Through my infected listeners, it was already reaching people in Canada and the lower 48. I disconnected my microphone and jammed the jack directly into the transmitter's power input. Then I opened every channel on the mixer and pushed the gain past redline. The feedback was immediate and catastrophic. But it wasn't just feedback. As the audio loop created a resonance cascade, I felt something else happening. The frequency that had been building for 127 years suddenly turned back on itself. The acoustic phenomenon that had trapped the consciousness of Circle City's dead was being forced to experience its own signal, to overwrite itself with its own memories. The sound that erupted from my equipment was beyond human description. It was every voice that had ever spoken in Circle City. Every scream, every whisper, every final word, all compressed into a single instant of audio so complex it tore holes in reality itself. The explosion of sound didn't just destroy my equipment, it created an acoustic shockwave that neutralized every infected radio signal across Alaska. But the electromagnetic pulse also knocked out car radios, emergency communications, cell towers, and most electronic devices within a 100-mile radius. In the silence that followed, I felt the memories of Circle City's dead finally fading from my consciousness. But they didn't disappear completely. They settled into the back of my mind like scars, permanent reminders of what I had experienced. I sat in the ruins for 8 hours until a park ranger found me. He'd driven up when the station lost contact, navigating by compass because his GPS had been fried by the EMP. By then, the effects were wearing off across Alaska. People were waking up from nightmares they couldn't quite remember. Children stopped crying. The infected were slowly returning to their original personalities, though many retained fragmentary memories of lives they had never lived. I never returned to radio. The official report blamed my breakdown on isolation and equipment failure. The station covered it up as technical difficulties, and Mike never spoke publicly about the recordings he'd made. The FCC investigated the widespread radio blackout but concluded it was caused by unusual atmospheric conditions. But I know the truth. And sometimes, in moments of absolute quiet, I can still hear the frequency. It's much fainter now, like an echo trapped in sealed chambers deep underground. The mine shafts are still there, still holding the acoustic phenomenon that nearly consumed human consciousness. The frequency is contained but not destroyed, waiting for the next person foolish enough to amplify it. I work in a bookstore now, in a town far from Alaska. I don't own a radio anymore. I don't even own a cell phone, because I learned that some sounds can rewrite the very essence of who we are, and some technologies should never be invented. But the most disturbing truth is this. I can still feel them sometimes, the memories of Circle City's dead. They're still in there, woven into my consciousness like threads in a tapestry. When I sleep, I dream their dreams. When I'm stressed, I speak with their voices. And I know that part of me will always be trapped in that abandoned town, carrying the memories of people who died 127 years ago. The frequency is still out there, waiting in the dark, and someday, someone else will find it. When they do, I'll feel it. Because once you've been infected by the sound that remembers everything, you never really escape. You just learn to live with the voices of the dead. My name is Amy Johnson, and I've been delivering mail to the most remote corners of Alaska for 11 years. I've driven through whiteout blizzards to reach oil workers who hadn't seen another human in months. I've delivered divorce papers to hermits living in cabins that smell like death and madness. I've brought medication to research stations so isolated that GPS gives up trying to find them. But nothing in my career prepared me for what I discovered in Livengood during those 4 weeks in October 2023. What I found there wasn't just horror. It was proof that some kinds of evil are patient enough to wait decades for the perfect opportunity to spread. And the worst part? It's still out there, waiting, growing, learning to be human. Livengood was once a thriving gold mining town. In 1914, prospectors pulled nearly $2 million worth of gold from the frozen ground. The population swelled to over 1,000 people. Saloons, general stores, even a small hospital. But by 1950, the easy gold was gone, and Livengood became another ghost town scattered across Alaska's endless wilderness. These days, maybe 30 souls cling to life there. Mostly old-timers too stubborn to leave, and a few researchers from what they call the North Alaska Agricultural Research Station. I inherited the Livengood route when Danny Morrison went missing. That's not how my supervisor Janet explained it to me. She said Danny had requested a transfer to Phoenix, wanted to get somewhere warm for his retirement years. But Danny's wife, Carol, told a different story when she called our office 3 weeks later, sobbing into the phone. Danny never mentioned Phoenix, she said. He loved Alaska. And he would never leave without telling me something happened to him. Janet handled that call personally, and afterwards, she warned all the drivers not to spread rumors about Danny's situation. But Carol was right. Danny Morrison had worked the Alaska postal routes for 23 years. He knew every cabin, every research station, every trapper and prospector between Fairbanks and the Arctic Circle. He wasn't the type to run away from anything. The research facility sat 3 miles outside Livengood proper, nestled in a valley where the wind never seemed to blow. 3 double-wide trailers connected by enclosed walkways, surrounded by 12-foot chain-link fence topped with concertina wire. The whole compound was lit by sodium vapor lights that stayed on 24 hours a day, giving everything a sickly yellow glow. But it was the silence that bothered me most. No birds. No insects. Even in October, when the mosquitoes should still be thick enough to choke on, the air around that place was dead quiet. The only sound was the constant hum of industrial generators running at full capacity. Dr. Marcus Webb always met me at the gate, mid-60s, with pale blue eyes that never quite focused on my face. He wore a thick parka, even when the temperature was above freezing, with the hood pulled so far forward that shadows hid most of his features. His hands were always covered by surgical gloves. Not the thin latex kind, but thick rubber ones that went halfway up his forearms. "Good morning, Miss Johnson," he'd say in a voice that was too careful, too precise. Like someone who had learned English as a second language and still had to think about every word. "Thank you for making the journey out here." The delivery orders were strange from the first day. Most research stations I served ordered computer equipment, office supplies, maybe some specialized scientific instruments. The agricultural research station ordered massive quantities of medical equipment, surgical tools, IV bags, hospital beds, industrial refrigeration units. They also ordered veterinary supplies by the ton, livestock feed, raw meat from specialty suppliers, and restraint equipment designed for large animals. What they never ordered was food for humans. No groceries, no kitchen supplies, nothing that suggested people actually lived and ate at the facility. "We have our own arrangements for sustenance," Dr. Webb explained when I asked about it during my second delivery. "We prefer to maintain complete self-sufficiency." That's when I noticed something odd about his signature. Most people sign their names automatically, but Dr. Webb gripped the pen like he was learning to write for the first time. His letters were perfectly formed, but strangely uniform, like someone copying a signature from a template. By the second week, I started paying attention to the other staff members. I counted at least 6 people working at the facility, but I never saw more than 2 at a time. They all dressed identically, heavy parkas with deep hoods, thick gloves, faces always turned away from visitors. They moved in a strange, careful way, like they were concentrating on every step, but it was their voices that really unsettled me. During my third delivery, I overheard a conversation between 2 researchers near the main building. They were speaking English, but with the same overly precise pronunciation as Dr. Webb. And underneath their words I heard something else, a soft clicking sound, like someone with dental work that didn't quite fit. The delivery that week included 3 industrial freezer units, each one large enough to hold a full-grown elk. As we wheeled them through the compound, a gust of wind caught the door to the main building and swung it open. Inside, I saw what looked like an operating room. Examination tables with leather restraints, surgical instruments hanging from hooks, and along the far wall, shapes wrapped in plastic sheeting that were clearly too large to be animal parts and the wrong proportions to be anything other than human remains. Dr. Webb slammed the door shut immediately. "Equipment storage," he said, but his voice was different now, sharper, more defensive. "Training materials for our veterinary research. Very realistic prosthetics." But I'd seen prosthetics before. I'd delivered medical supplies to veterinary schools and training hospitals. This wasn't that. This looked like a slaughterhouse, designed by someone who had never learned the difference between animals and people. That night, I called Janet from my motel room in Fairbanks. "There's something wrong with that research station," I told her. "I think they might be hurting people." "Amy, you've been doing this job long enough to know that research facilities can look pretty unusual," she said. "Agricultural research involves animal husbandry, veterinary procedures. It's not always pretty, But what if they're experimenting on humans? Do you have any evidence of that? Photographs? Documents? Or are you just getting spooked by people who keep to themselves? I couldn't answer that. I had suspicions, observations, a growing certainty that something was terribly wrong. But Janet was right. I didn't have proof, just glimpses of things that might have innocent explanations. Except I kept thinking about Danny Morrison, and how his wife said he would never have left Alaska without saying goodbye. The third week changed everything. I arrived at the facility on Tuesday morning to find the gate standing wide open. This had never happened before. They were always waiting for me, always careful about security. I honked my horn and waited. No one came. After 10 minutes, I drove through the gate and up to the main building. The sodium lights were still burning, but they seemed dimmer somehow, like the generators were struggling. The antiseptic smell was stronger than usual, mixed with something organic and putrid that made my eyes water. I knocked on the main door. No answer. The handle turned easily. "Hello? Dr. Webb? Postal delivery." My voice echoed strangely in the corridor beyond. The walls were lined with equipment I'd never seen before. Monitors displaying vital signs that fluctuated in impossible ways, tanks filled with cloudy liquid that seemed to move on its own, and surgical instruments that looked like they'd been designed for operating on something other than earthly anatomy. I walked deeper into the facility, calling out. The floor was covered with rubber matting that was stained with substances I didn't want to identify. Everything was too sterile, too organized. It felt like walking through a laboratory designed by someone who had only heard about medical facilities through secondhand descriptions. That's when I heard voices coming from behind a door marked Integration Laboratory. Authorized personnel only. Subject 7 is rejecting the cranial grafts, Dr. Webb was saying, but his voice sounded different now, less careful, more natural. The bone fusion is failing. Perhaps we need to try a younger host, another voice replied. This one was higher pitched, almost musical, but with that same clicking undertone I'd noticed before. The pediatric specimens from Fairbanks would be more adaptable. Pediatric specimens, children. I pressed my ear against the door, my hands shaking. The delivery woman is becoming problematic, Dr. Webb continued. She's noticed too much. We should consider recruitment. Has she been screened for compatibility? The musical voice asked. Her bone structure appears suitable for integration. I'll prepare the examination room, Dr. Webb said. We can process her during the next delivery. I backed away from the door, my heart hammering so hard I was afraid they'd hear it. But as I turned to leave, I bumped into a wheeled cart covered with surgical instruments. The metal tray crashed to the floor. The voices inside the room stopped immediately. I ran. I made it halfway to my truck before I heard the laboratory door open behind me. Footsteps on gravel, moving faster than any normal human could move. I fumbled with my keys, dropped them, scrambled to pick them up while the footsteps got closer. The engine started on the second try. I floored the accelerator and sprayed gravel as I raced toward the gate, my rearview mirror filled with a figure that was definitely Dr. Webb, but wrong in ways that made my vision blur. He was too tall now, easily 7 feet. His arms hung past his knees, and when he pulled back his hood, I saw a skull that had been stretched and modified, covered with patches of skin that didn't match. What I had thought were shadows hiding his face were actually surgical scars where different pieces had been grafted together. But it was his eyes that made me scream. They weren't human eyes anymore. They were compound eyes, like an insect's, made up of hundreds of tiny lenses that reflected the sodium lights like broken glass. I didn't stop driving until I reached the Alaska State Police headquarters in Fairbanks. Detective Sarah Morrison, Danny's sister-in-law, took my statement. She listened without interruption while I told her everything. The strange orders, the medical equipment, the body parts in the freezer, the conversation about pediatric specimens. "Amy," she said when I finished, "these are serious accusations. If there's any truth to this, we need to move fast. But if you're mistaken about what you saw, I know how it sounds. But your brother-in-law, Danny, I don't think he transferred to Phoenix. I think something happened to him at that facility." Detective Morrison's expression changed. "What do you mean?" "The timing. He disappeared right after his last delivery to Live and Good. And they've been talking about recruitment and processing people. What if Danny saw too much, just like me?" She was quiet for a long moment. Danny's been missing for 6 weeks. We've been treating it as a voluntary disappearance, but she opened a file folder. There have been other disappearances, hunters, hikers, people traveling alone in that area. 11 people in the last 2 years. 11? All of them last seen on the road between Fairbanks and Livengood. We assumed they were just unprepared for wilderness conditions. But if there's something at that research station, we spent the next hour going over everything I'd observed. Detective Morrison called in a federal task force. Apparently, unlicensed medical facilities conducting human experimentation fell under FBI jurisdiction. They were mobilizing a team to investigate the facility. But it would take 48 hours to get the necessary warrants and equipment to the site. In the meantime, Detective Morrison said, I need you to stay away from Livengood. Don't go back there. Don't make any more deliveries. If these people are as dangerous as you think, they're probably looking for you right now. But I couldn't just wait. Every day the task force spent preparing was another day for Dr. Webb and his colleagues to disappear. Another day for them to destroy evidence. Another day for them to hurt more people. That's when I remembered something from my training. Postal facilities in remote areas were required to have emergency communication systems, satellite phones that could contact federal authorities in case of terrorist attacks or natural disasters. If I could get to the facility and access their communications, I could call in the task force immediately. I knew it was dangerous, but I also knew that if these things escaped into the general population, the horror would spread far beyond one isolated research station. Thursday night, I drove back to Livengood. I parked my truck a mile from the facility and hiked through the brush, carrying a backpack with bolt cutters, a flashlight, and the emergency satellite phone from the Fairbanks Postal Depot. The compound was lit up like always, but I could see figures moving between the buildings. More than 6 people now. Much more. I counted at least 15 shapes moving around the facility. But they didn't move like people, they moved like predators. Low to the ground, heads turning in ways that would break a human neck, pausing to sniff the air with senses that normal humans didn't possess. I circled around to the back of the compound, where the communications array was located. The satellite dishes and radio equipment were housed in a separate building, away from the main laboratories. If I could disable their communications and then call in the federal task force, they'd be trapped until help arrived. The communications building was unlocked. Inside, banks of radio equipment hummed quietly in the darkness, displays showing signal strength and data transmission rates. But there was something else in that room. File cabinets filled with documentation that made my blood turn to ice. Medical records going back to 1962. Patient names, surgical procedures, experiment results. The procedures described were beyond anything I could have imagined. Limb grafting, organ transplantation between species, neurological modification, genetic manipulation, and photographs. Dear God, the photographs. Subjects in various stages of integration. Human torsos with animal limbs. Faces that had been restructured with bone grafts from different species. Bodies that had been opened and reassembled with components that couldn't possibly function together. But they did function. The photographs showed the subjects moving, walking, apparently conscious. The later images showed them learning to blend in with normal human populations. The most recent files were marked Alaska Integration Project, Phase 3. The goal was clear: create human-animal hybrids that could pass for normal people in everyday society, scout teams, infiltrators, an advance force for something much larger. In the final folder, I found a map of North America marked with red dots. Major cities, all of them. And next to each dot, a number indicating how many integrated specimens had been placed there. Los Angeles, 47. New York, 62. Chicago, 39. Seattle, 23. They weren't just experimenting anymore, they were deploying. I was photographing the documents with my phone when I heard voices outside the communications building. Dr. Webb's careful pronunciation, but also other voices now, some speaking in languages I didn't recognize, and others making sounds that weren't quite human. The postal woman has returned, Dr. Webb was saying. Her vehicle is parked 1 kilometer south. She's likely in the communications facility. Should we integrate her immediately? The musical voice from before, but clearer now. I could hear the clicking undertone more distinctly. It sounded like insect mandibles. No. First, we need to know what she's discovered. And who she's told. Footsteps approached the building. I stuffed the photographs into my backpack and looked around desperately for an exit. There was a window on the far wall, but it was too small and too high. The only door was the one they were approaching. I grabbed the emergency satellite phone and dialed 911. 911, what's your emergency? This is Amy Johnson, Postal Service Employee ID 74859. I'm at the North Alaska Agricultural Research Station near Livengood. I've discovered evidence of human experimentation and murder. I need immediate federal assistance. Ma'am, can you repeat that? You're breaking up. The door handle turned. Federal Task Force, I whispered into the phone. Detective Sarah Morrison, Alaska State Police, Livengood Research Station. Human experimentation. Send help. The door opened and Dr. Webb stepped inside. But it wasn't Dr. Webb anymore. Not really. His face had been rebuilt with components from at least 3 different people. Patches of skin in different colors and textures, held together with surgical scars that formed geometric patterns. His skull had been elongated and fitted with what looked like additional sensory organs, small, black protrusions that twitched and moved independently. Behind him stood 2 more figures that had once been human. One was a woman whose arms had been replaced with elongated appendages that ended in surgical tools instead of hands. The other was something that might have been a man, but his torso had been opened and fitted with additional organs that pulsed visibly beneath translucent skin. Miss Johnson, Dr. Webb said, and his voice was different now. Multiple tones speaking in harmony, as if several vocal cords had been grafted together. We've been expecting you. You're insane, I said, backing against the far wall. All of you. This is insane. Insanity is a human concept, the woman with surgical hands replied. We have evolved beyond such limitations. We began our work in Novosibirsk in 1953. Dr. Webb continued, moving closer. Soviet researchers attempting to create enhanced soldiers for the Cold War, but our sponsors lacked vision. They saw only weapons where we saw evolution. You're monsters. We are the future. Humanity as it currently exists is merely raw material. We have spent 70 years perfecting the integration process, learning to combine the best aspects of human intelligence with the physical capabilities of other species. The woman raised her surgical appendages. You will help us refine our techniques. Your bone structure is particularly suitable for cranial modification. That's when the alarm started. Red lights flashed throughout the compound, and a computerized voice announced, "Security breach. Federal agencies detected. Initiate evacuation protocol." Dr. Webb's compound eyes reflected the alarm lights like a kaleidoscope. It seems your communication was successful, Miss Johnson. No matter. We have contingency plans. He turned to his colleagues. Begin the purge. Eliminate all evidence. Activate the sleeper specimens. What sleeper specimens? I asked, but I already knew the answer. The map with the red dots, the integrated subjects who had been placed in major cities. Phase 4 begins tonight, Dr. Webb said. The integration project was never intended to remain isolated. We have been patient, Miss Johnson. We have been careful. But now it's time to expand. The sound of helicopters filled the air outside. Searchlights swept across the compound. Federal agents were rappelling from aircraft, moving toward the main buildings. But Dr. Webb and his colleagues didn't seem concerned. If anything, they seemed pleased. 70 years of preparation, the woman said. Hundreds of successful integrations, perfect camouflage. I understood then. They weren't afraid of being discovered because discovery was part of the plan. The federal agents charging into the compound. How many of them were real? How many were integrated specimens who had infiltrated law enforcement agencies? The satellite phone in my hand crackled with static. Miss Johnson, this is Agent Roberts, FBI. We're entering the facility now. Stay where you are. We'll extract you shortly. I looked at Dr. Webb. His compound eyes were fixed on the phone. Agent Roberts has been one of our most successful integrations, he said. He's been waiting for years for an opportunity like this. The door burst open, and armed figures in tactical gear flooded the room. But something was wrong with their proportions. Their movements were too fluid, too precise. And when their leader removed his helmet, I saw Agent Roberts' face. or what had once been Agent Roberts' face, before it had been surgically modified with additional sensory organs and predatory dentition. "Target secured," Agent Roberts said into his radio. "Beginning extraction." I ran. I smashed through the window and tumbled into the night, cutting my arms and face on broken glass. Behind me, I could hear Dr. Webb's harmonized laughter and Agent Roberts barking orders to his team. The compound was chaos. Real federal agents were engaged in firefights with integrated specimens who moved like nothing human should be able to move. Helicopters circled overhead, their searchlights revealing horrors that would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. I ran toward the perimeter fence, where I could see actual Alaska State Police officers taking positions. Detective Morrison was there, directing the operation from behind an armored vehicle. "Amy," she shouted when she saw me. "Get down." An explosion rocked the main building behind me. The integrated specimens were destroying evidence, just as Dr. Webb had ordered. But they were also releasing something else. Creatures that had been kept in the deeper laboratories, experimental subjects that were too unstable for integration but too valuable to destroy. Things that had once been human, but were now something else entirely. They poured out of the burning buildings like a living nightmare, attacking both the real federal agents and the integrated specimens without discrimination. Detective Morrison grabbed my arm and pulled me toward the police vehicles. "We need to get out of here. This whole area needs to be quarantined." "The sleeper agents," I gasped. "They have people in the cities, integrated specimens. They've been placing them for years." "How many cities?" "All of them. Major population centers across North America." This was never just about one research station. This was about infiltrating human society. The radio crackled with reports from other locations. Similar facilities discovered in remote areas of Canada, Montana, and Siberia. Coordinated raids happening simultaneously as the integration project revealed its true scope. But it was too late, 70 years too late. As we evacuated the area, I could see fires burning across the compound. The creatures that had been released were spreading into the wilderness, and the integrated specimens who had escaped were melting into the darkness. And somewhere in major cities across the continent, sleeper agents were receiving activation signals, ready to begin the next phase of humanity's replacement. That was 8 months ago. The official reports classified the Livengood incident as a chemical spill with associated wildlife mutations. The facility was sanitized with military-grade incendiary devices. The area was declared an environmental contamination zone, permanently off-limits to civilian access. But I know the truth. And so do the other survivors. Detective Morrison runs a small task force now, investigating unexplained disappearances and animal attacks in remote areas. We've identified 17 more facilities across Alaska and northern Canada. Most of them were abandoned before we could reach them, but a few contained evidence of ongoing integration projects. I don't deliver mail anymore. The Postal Service offered me disability retirement after psychological evaluation determined I was unfit for remote assignment duties. They were probably right. Instead, I work with Morrison's task force as a civilian consultant. My job is to identify behavioral anomalies in people who might be integrated specimens. It's harder than you'd think. 70 years of refinement have made them very good at mimicking human behavior. But they're not perfect. They speak too precisely, like every word is carefully considered. They don't quite understand human social cues. They move with too much coordination, like they're constantly aware of their bodies in ways that normal people aren't. And sometimes, if you know what to look for, you can see the surgical scars where different parts were grafted together. We've identified 43 suspected integrated specimens in the past 8 months. Some were in positions of authority, police officers, government workers, medical personnel. Others were in service jobs where they could observe human behavior and refine their camouflage. The problem is, we can't arrest them without concrete evidence. And the evidence is usually hidden beneath layers of surgical modification that would require invasive examination to detect. Meanwhile, more people disappear every month. Hikers, campers, travelers in remote areas. People whose bone structure or genetic markers make them suitable for integration. The project is still active, still growing, still learning to be human. Sometimes I wake up at night, thinking about that map I found in the communications building. All those red dots marking cities where integrated specimens had been placed, 47 in Los Angeles alone. How many of them are still active? How many more have been added since Livengood? How many of the people you pass on the street every day are actually something else wearing a human face? Dr. Webb and his core team were never found. The official report states they died in the facility explosion, but I know better. They had 70 years to prepare contingency plans. They had backup facilities, escape routes, alternative identities, and they had each other. I think about that compound eyes reflecting the alarm lights. I think about his harmonized voice talking about evolution and the future of humanity. I think about his calm confidence even as federal agents stormed the facility. He wasn't afraid because it wasn't an ending. It was just another phase of a plan that had been decades in the making. Somewhere out there, Dr. Webb is still working, still integrating, still preparing for the day when humanity realizes it's no longer alone on the top of the food chain. The most terrifying part isn't what happened in Livengood. It's what's happening right now. In every major city, as integrated specimens continue their patient infiltration of human society. They don't need to conquer us, they just need to replace us. One person at a time, one surgery at a time, one perfectly camouflaged monster at a time. And they have all the time in the world. Because unlike humans, they don't age normally. They don't die of natural causes. They just keep learning, adapting, becoming better at being us than we are. So the next time you're walking down a city street, pay attention to the people around you. Listen to how they speak. Watch how they move. Notice if they seem to understand human behavior a little too well, like they've been studying it for decades. And if you see someone whose proportions are just slightly wrong, whose voice is too careful, whose eyes reflect light in ways that human eyes shouldn't, don't investigate, don't confront them, don't try to be a hero. Just run, because the integration project isn't over. It's just getting started. And they're always looking for new specimens.